Today, I want to talk about starting over. There's been a number of things recently where I've really found myself needing to start over or continue on a different level. That's something we'll talk about in today's episodes. Some life updates are that as I've traveled back to Austin, I went to an investment banking conference in the Woodlands, and then we'll be in Dallas next week looking at our oil rigs and talking with a number of investors and people really to offset taxes and get income from that investment. Now, in terms of starting over, we're going to talk about today with Matt of how he's had a journey from doing 1 to 4 properties to then doing $1 million+ properties in a property that ultimately burnt down, which caused him to then start over. I believe that this is something that was ultimately fascinating within our lives, that we always feel that when bad things happen, we don't want to continue or don't know how to continue, but then we're reminded that we can ultimately ride a bike. And so in today's episode, that's something that I ultimately want you to remember, is that if you are starting over, either metaphorically or physically, or trying something new, ultimately thinking of how to ride the bike, what got you here will not get you there, and then ultimately focusing on this season of subtraction. That's another thing that I've really been focused on after I came back from my trip to Dubai a couple of weeks ago. And the idea around what am I doing? How is it fostering and continuing to nurture and support the future version of myself? And ultimately, do I want to allow that? And can I allow that? Subtraction is ultimately something we desire to control, but ultimately we sometimes can't. We often want to control subtraction, but ultimately we recognize that we can't. Again, Matt didn't plan on one of his properties burning down. He also didn't plan on losing his parents. And so ultimately, as we strive for a bigger life, it ultimately means that we want to continue to be the best version of ourselves, understanding who that is and going forward it. So today's episode, I'm excited to share about the insights we learn around this topic and so much more within commercial real estate and with life.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Investor's Guide to Joy. Today we have Matt Drouin, who's going to go through his experience within commercial real estate, as well as some key pivotal moments in his life that ultimately we should be taking away for how we should not only present ourselves today, but also the things that we're doing today. So Matt, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to dive into some deep stuff today.
Yeah, reflect on life. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, you've been able to, amass, commercial real estate portfolio. You've been able to, transact a lot of deals and, do a lot of things. You've had pivotal moments in terms of like reinventing yourself and, kind of becoming, new in a lot of ways. What were some of those reinventing moments? And then let's, dive into a couple of them in more detail.
All right. So the chapters, let me think of the first one, because the first chapter was as a daydreaming, like listless, directionless young adult. One of the characters I really resonate with is Sebastian from the Neverending Story. The kid that kind of just like daydreams all day. And I was kind of like had this mentality of just being okay with coasting. And then, I've had some like really things where, God or the universe have like really placed some traumatic things in my life that I think were a really, wake up call for me. And I lost both my parents in my 20s due to health reasons. My mother at 22 and my father at 28. And, the first time, my mother passed away, it was kind of like this, it was the first kind of wake up call that, you're not invincible and you're not immortal and you only have one life. And that really kind of got me started to developing this sense of urgency, which I never had. And I think that sense of urgency with the passing of my mother kind of like led me down to this like rabbit hole of trying to find a path to exit the matrix of trading your time for dollars. Because, my parents split when I was pretty young and it was due to financial reasons. My mother's funeral services, my dad, told me something that really kind of hacked me off and made me angry at the time. But he said he placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Matt, I really wish I would have worked things out with your mom." And I was like, I thought these were irreconcilable differences, and it was money. And that's what the strain that is placed on a lot of relationships that makes them fall apart. And so I was just like, okay, I have to get out of this thing here. So I made the commitment and this obsession to become financially independent by the time I was 40 years old. And so I found real estate as an avenue for that. I originally thought I was going to be investing in stocks and day trading and that sort of thing. I thought I was going to be this cigar chomping Gordon Gekko type and, get a job in Wall Street, for instance. And that never panned out because I graduated college in 2006 and like nobody was hiring at that point in time. But, long story long, I bought my first investment properties, an owner occupant, 4-family. I kind of bought that by accident because I hadn't discovered real estate at this point in time. And my dad was kind of like pushing me out of the nest because I was like, living with him and it wasn't really, his dream to have like a, 20 something year old, like, man child living in his house forever. So he said like, you earn some commissions and save some commissions from, selling all those like grinder $40,000 duplexes in Rochester, New York. So go out and get an apartment with your friends or buy a property. And I didn't like the idea of paying rent because I'd gotten so comfy with not paying rent to my dad. And, I went out there and I found a fourplex and I closed in that property. And on the first of the next month, I got like $1,800 in rent checks in my mailbox. Now, to remind you, I was selling like $40,000 duplexes, like and earning a 3% cooperative commission on those deals. Like $1,800 was a lot of money and it felt almost criminal at the time. And this is where I kind of got introduced to like, okay, there's some work involved with this, but this is like a passive-ish income and that I don't have to have like a commensurate like trading of, equal trading of inputs of labor to, create income. And so that's kind of how I kind of started the warpath on scaling a portfolio. And I got up to about like 14, 15 units or so. And then my dad passed. And this was kind of like, God like slapping me again and being like, you gotta, what about that dream you had? Like keep that obsession because, my dad passed like in the middle of the night in his sleep. And so the sense of urgency thing again, and I kind of cranked up, I thought that I was at like, volume 10, making a Spinal Tap reference. And I was like, all right, I got to crank this thing up to 11. And so I started, basically doing direct mail campaigns, acquiring a lot of smaller multifamily properties. I was able to get up to, for over 11-year period, acquire 25 properties, which led to 76 doors. And I was able to replace my income by the time I've turned 33 years old. And that was kind of like, end of chapter 2, start of chapter 3 was this thing that I had been obsessed with over the 11 years I finally achieved. And I was like, what is next? And I really had this like probably one of the most like crushingly brutal moments of depression in my life. And I was feeling listless again. Nobody, quote unquote, needed me. And I was just like, what is next? So I really, really thought on it. I had, this moment of stillness for, a few weeks. I picked up this book called The 10X Rule by Grant Cardone. And I was like, okay, I need to like start a new goal, one that, might not be able to be achieved in my life. So then I have something, a destination that I can keep shooting for until then. So I knew that my wife was, she was still working at Hilton High School teaching math. And my dream of going backpacking through Europe for 2 months at a time wasn't going to be a thing if she was stuck in a classroom teaching math. So I was like, okay, I want to replace her income, teacher's salary of $60,000. So that's not, it's not, too high. And I wanted to do it with one deal. So I knew that I needed to do commercial, larger commercial, either multifamily, office, industrial, retailer, whatever, in order to achieve that. So I ended up finding a deal that, I had to take down as $1 million deal. It was the first time I actually had to like raise capital for a down payment on the property. And that deal alone, fast forward, replaced my wife's income and added $500,000 to our net worth. And at that point in time, I was like, well, I can't go back to what I was doing before. So let's focus on this thing. But I'd want to be less busy. Freedom is great, but freedom without peace was not a type of lifestyle that I wanted to have. So I was like, okay, if I can just do this thing, scale, keep myself intellectually like curious and stimulated, and just buy one bigger deal a year and just kind of push the envelope in terms of complexity and moving parts, then, that would make me happy. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. I mean, it's a great story, right? I definitely resonate a lot with it. I'm sorry to hear you've lost both your parents. I lost my brother a couple of years ago. And so, can have some relation to that. There's an interesting thought about urgency, right? And that's one thing that I've always felt, my parents are in their 70s. And so I've always felt like, hey, I don't have a lot of time with them. So therefore I got to do and go and, things like that. So, looking back, because I have this, reflection, the urgency helps build, right? But it's just a matter of like, if it stays. And so I don't want to use like the word regret in some ways, but it's more of, is there something that you've realized that you do or operate or have a perspective now that you wish would be like a piece of advice or a reflection? Maybe it's even tactical of like, hey, I really felt like I had to work on Saturdays, but I ultimately found that I just needed to structure my week better or something like that, right? What kind of comes to mind in terms of talking about urgency from where you've been and what it's like today?
Not sure if this is answering your question, but I mean, one of the things that kind of resonates in my mind is that I should have went bigger sooner.
Okay.
I got very comfortable with this. I perfected a direct mail framework for buying small multifamily properties. And I was very comfortable, even though I was like burning the candle at both ends. I mean, it was a very, very tough environment to be closing on 1 to 2 deals a month during that build period. And I always had this like self-limiting belief that I had to be big or I had to have enough units or experience in order for the university to give me permission to scale and do bigger deals. So that's one of the things I would have wished I would have, done sooner, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
Yeah. I mean, it changes the frame of what the urgency like is for, right? Because ultimately, think of like a hamster in a wheel, right? And if you're just constantly like moving, and it's the difference of hard work equals success, right? And it could just be more of like alignment and beneficial actions that then create, right? To your point of, hey, I'm trying to create $60,000 worth of value. Well, great, that was done with one deal. What kind of time frame have you found with commercial deals? Has that been 6 to 18 months sort of timeline? Or
I mean, generally right now, I mean, that was a 12-month period where I was able to buy that property and push it to about $1.6 million worth of valuation. This was a light value add office deal. It was not a home run on paper. It was not at all. And it looked like mediocre on paper, but there wasn't a lot of moving parts in terms of the layers of risk where you have lease up risk and development risk and construction risk and the stuff that we're doing now with our development company. So, I actually like singles and doubles, like to use baseball terminology rather than home runs. So, I think that the deals we're focused on now in terms of turnaround, because we have a lot more patience right now. The building I'm sitting in right now, the Wilder building, this is going to be a 5-year project. And it might be 7 years until we can actually like get our money or equity back out of the deal. So earlier on, but those smaller wins, those deals that don't have as much hair on them and don't have as much moving parts, those are, generally we can do those within 12 to 18 months. Okay. But, the deals that have more complexities to them just take longer and have more risk.
Yeah. Okay. No, makes sense. In terms of bigger, like what would you define that as? Maybe as like a step 1 and step 2. And so what I'm thinking of is oftentimes when I hear people think of like, oh, I should have gone bigger sooner, they're maybe tackling like $40 million properties, but the next big thing they did was like a $5 million thing. So my point is that oftentimes when we hear podcasts, we hear about the most amazing, biggest, thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, 40 million, that's crazy. Maybe I should go for the 40 million. And my response is, no, you shouldn't, in the sense of, have an understanding of what comes to be with the 40 million. So it's not to say, don't do in this example, the 40, but it's just having the understanding of what takes for the 40, because ultimately it's a lot easier to go from top down than it is from bottom up. There's more nuances. There's more at stake. If you don't have, you lose earnest money, you could lose, $100,000, right? So, it's those kind of things. So what was that, kind of step 1, step 2 in terms of quote unquote, bigger?
Significant and achievable. I think there's I don't know, I guess I maybe label it, a pressure gradient. There's things that I do now on a daily basis in terms of decisions that we have to make that if I rewound the clock back even a couple of years ago would be absolutely just crushing. So I think that, bigger is a relative term. I think the bigger by the way you have to measure that is achievable and significant. I don't think that, at least this is my personality, I don't want to get into this sort of like block and tackle, doing the same thing over and over again. That works for some people, but for me, in order to keep myself stimulated and curious, and also just see what I can do, I think is kind of like what keeps me, what brings me joy. For instance, even though at sometimes the stress is very, very high and the stakes are very high as well. And I think that first 4-family I bought, I mean, I was scared. Put 40-unit deal in front of me, like I wouldn't even know what to do about it, even if it was a smoking hot deal. So I think that, pushing into that pressure gradient over time, it takes time. But as long as you're making strides on, I don't want to say baby steps, but, small steps going on, scale and complexity. I think that that's probably a healthy way to do it. But, that's just my opinion.
Sure. Okay. What was that like dollar amount for you
In what regard?
in terms of like what you started to tackle? So like beyond 1 through 4, like, what was that?
Yeah, so a lot of it was, 1 through 4 families, and then I bought a 6 family, and then bought a $1 million office deal. It was like a 22,000 square foot office deal, and then a 28 unit deal, 28 unit apartment deal, mixed use property after that, and then there was never this like jump from I guess like $1 million deal to a $10 million deal. The deal that we have in front of us right now, in terms of reimagining the Wilder building and 17 East Main Street, which are part of the Four Corners district in downtown Rochester, that's going to be probably about a $25 million deal in, considering the entire future capital stack, for instance. And so the largest deal we've done at this point in time is a $4 million deal. So I think that there is an exponential factor to it. I don't think that we would really want to do like another, like, let's say, I don't know, another $5 million deal, for instance, or a $6 million deal. Like I said, I'm not really doing this I don't need the income. I'm completely financially sustained. I don't have any creeping like lifestyle like demands that I have this gun against my head to push the envelope for those reasons. I'm doing it solely for the fact of keeping myself growing, and then also doing things that create positive social and economic impacts in my community. And then thirdly, I think that if I was on my deathbed and I didn't do this historic adaptive reuse project at Wilder and Four Corners Rochester, I think that I would have regrets, and I don't want to have those regrets. So that's the reason why we're doing this project, for instance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so talk more about community impact sort of piece, what that looks like. It doesn't seem like it's buy the multifamily property, renovate it, kick everyone out, and force them out type thing.
Yeah. So if I rewind the clock a little bit, there was a 28 unit apartment deal that I acquired. I think it was probably about 6 years ago or so. It was a very, very heavily distressed deal. It was about 60% occupied, was notorious in the neighborhood. The only reason I bought this thing was it was 2 blocks away from my house. That's the only reason I bought it. And because I wanted to help improve the neighborhood, I wanted to help reprogram the retail so as to improve street level vitality for the neighborhood by curating, great retail concepts for there. But, there was also, prostitution and drug dealing and human trafficking happening out of this building. So there's a certain amount of people like were like non-negotiable. We had to boot out of there. But we were able to, to actually get, negotiate deals with I think 4 or 5 of the tenants that have been there for a long time that paid on time, kept to themselves, and were just like, good people and good members of the community that we renovated apartments and transferred them into and at like super reduced discounted rates. And they're still there to this day. I think that a lot of developers will go into a project like that and being like, all right, I got to boot every single person out of here. They even do it on deals that really aren't that distressed, as this deal, for instance. They'll just be like, all right, well, we're increasing rents a couple $100 a month, so we're just going to like, kick everybody to the curb. And, those types of actions, I don't think that developers really understand how much damage that does to community. When people lose their housing, for instance, it can spiral into a whole cascade of factors that will, change their life for the worse. Those folks that you see that are like panhandling on the side of the road, like they came from somewhere. They probably lived in a house at some point in time. So what happened?
Yeah. So, for these type of properties too, sometimes it's also important to think about the class of properties, right? So I've seen how within, multis, for example, individuals will buy like a C class to try to improve it to a B, if you will, but just the neighborhood, the area like is a C. And it's like, yeah, we have, issues with, murders or disturbances or this kind of stuff. Like it just is sort of the population, but there's also an opportunity to, create more cohesiveness and community, within that. Is there anything like you're doing specifically to create that, cohesive type, community, and maybe again, kind of a C or beyond type property?
Yeah. So, the project that we're in pre-development on right now, the Wilder building, for instance, this is going to be a residential conversion at some point in time. But because we got such a great buy on the building from a low basis standpoint, we're able to really cut aggressive lease deals with commercial, entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, to give them a shot. Space that is like affordable for them to start their business, for instance. And so the idea is that we're going to create like a little mini Wall Street here at this building. And then we own two buildings that are right next door to each other. So once we go forward with the actual like residential conversion, that we are going to like stack these tenants that have been able to actually create sustainable, viable business, and creating that business community downtown with these tenants as well. So this is kind of another example of how we look at community interests front and center with what we do, because we have the opportunity to. Because the thing that other developers don't really understand too is that the decisions they make right now, they're not going to like affect the community within the next like 24 months. They're going to affect the community for decades going forward. People that don't even exist yet are going to be impacted by the decisions you make now. So taking that into mind and thinking long term on your decisions and how you program either redevelopments or repositionings with deals you do acquire.
Yeah, as you've done a number of different projects and deals and help foster these things, like we had a chance to talk about refinement and decreasing things that you are doing. Not really where did that come from? Because oftentimes, like I've seen individuals do that. Maybe we over leverage or we just reprioritize or things like that. So that could certainly be the case, and that's going to be individual dependent, right? But ultimately, as you're going through and eliminating, and the idea of like subtracting, I want to have you share more about like what sort of discernment do you have in terms of what you're subtracting and how you're going about it, right? Is it things that are based on time? Is it more of like a future thing? I mean, certainly it could be a lot of factors, but I'm curious like what those inputs are, not just here are the things that I'm eliminating, but it's how are you going through that thought process of eliminating these things in your life right now?
The two words that come to mind are lucrative and fun.
Okay.
So if it's not lucrative or fun, then it's not going to be in my life.
Okay.
And by lucrative, a lot of people think like, okay, like financial. I mean, lucrative things can also be enriching as well. So sure. In this season of subtraction, based upon, we were talking about this in the green room, the, devastating fire that happened at one of our buildings due to arson. I want to get, I've always been a huge fan of cooking and the culinary arts and that sort of thing. And so I've always done it, but I want to get to, dedicate more of my time towards that.
Okay.
I love food. The food is grown somewhere, so it connects us with the land, and then we eat together as food. So we get connected with the land, we get connected to each other, and so that's another thing that I'm focusing on. It's enriching. It's a skill that I'm definitely not a master of, and I can always get better at in terms of learning new techniques. So that's just like one example of something that's always existed, not always existed, but for the last like 20 years of my life is this passion for food and the culinary arts. So, that's just like one thing that is going to, stay in my life, for instance. This project that we're about to undergo is going to be a very complex project with a very complicated capital stack with more funding sources than whatever dealt with in terms of the capital stack, from historic tax credits to Restore New York dollars to, green energy credits and all that stuff. And my objective with this is I'm already too deep into this to back out of it. All right. So, but there's that regret component too. Is like, if I would have regretted not doing this if I didn't, do it at least once. So we're going to do this project. And if it's not lucrative and not fun, then we may never do another project like this again. So I guess only time and fate will tell what our future is in projects like this. They're this size.
Yeah. Okay. And as you are kind of, pruning and subtracting these things, what are you allowing to fill it? I mean, you kind of mentioned, it's food, which is a great, opportunity. Is it, what is being filled, or are you open to what could fill, as you subtract?
Yeah, I was talking about this again also in the green room, is that I'm making the considered effort to not allow things to take that space. I find that my best moments of creativity